Okay everybody, so today we're going to be going through a rundown of a heart dissection. You should have been given some introductory information as to the heart. You really should know something about the heart from GCSE, so I'm just going to go straight into it. This is a lamb heart. This is something that you can buy commercially, so I know that there's a few dishes you can make using heart as the meat. It's just a bag of muscle really. It tastes like a sort of chewy steak. So looking at the sort of general anatomy of the heart, this is the way it would roughly be positioned inside. In this case it would be a lamb, but in vivo. Rather counterintuitively, the bottom, or what we consider the bottom of the heart, is called the apex because it's sort of a pointed cone shape roughly. And here on the bottom half we've got our two ventricles, our left and right sides, and up here, although it might be so because this is a commercially produced heart, they tend to slice through the atria. So these sort of flaps here are the remnants of our left and right atria. Now you should know that the mammalian circulatory system, for the most part, is a double circulatory system with the left and right side of the heart servicing each loop. So the right hand side, and again this is sort of stage right, so in this case I think the right hand side would be here, would be servicing the pulmonary circuit, which is your lungs and where gas exchange takes place, and then the left hand side services, or at least from a ventricular standpoint, services the rest of the body. And as such, in particular when it comes to the ventricles, the left hand side is a lot thicker than the right because it needs to exert more force on the blood to get it through a longer circuit. So you can often tell the difference between left and right either visually or by feeling the thickness of the walls. It's not always as easy as that, especially in meat that's a bit old perhaps. I have a feeling, just from the feeling, that this is the right hand side and that's the left, just from how thick the walls feel. So you might be able to trace that line and say that's the left, that's the right. Maybe not, we'll have a look at it once we open it up. At the top you've got all this fatty tissue surrounding the heart. This is just cushioning and insulation. And you see we've got a fair few vessels and the remnants of our atria at the top here. I apologise, this is going to be gruesome, there's no real way around that. And you can see this, I'm going to hazard a guess, this thick, large vessel coming out of what looks to me like the left ventricle, although we'll have a more in-depth look as we go in, is probably going to be the aorta, which is the major blood vessel coming off of the left ventricle. And that's sort of in vivo, would then, in a human example, would then arc over to the left, and then arteries would branch off your brachiocephalic and your subclavian, I think, and they would branch off into the arteries that feed the upper body, so your head and your arms, and obviously your upper chest, and then would descend down behind the heart and feed the rest of the body. And I'm not sure if they sometimes survive, but oftentimes if you dig in, you can often find the first offshoots off of the aorta, which would be your coronary arteries. So the heart obviously needs its own blood supply, it's a muscle, and so sometimes you can often find the branch off points, although it might be easier to see when we get in there. Okay, so I'm just going to whip out my scalpel, wherever that's gone, and we're just going to open up, I think this will be one of the atria, and you can see down in there going into the ventricle. So I'm just going to open up, sort of slicing along there, which I think is, I have a feeling, although it's really hard to tell at this point which is the left and right side, personally anyway. And as we open it up, I'm going to point out some key features and key structures and explain their functions, as is the required practical. Obviously you're going to have to be using quite sharp instruments, so I'm going to be very careful not to stab myself, because that would be bad in general. Yeah, I think that's the right side. Yeah, okay. So one way you can tell which is left and right is quite grossly by sticking your finger in the heart and then feeling the difference in the ventricles in particular, and feeling the difference in thickness. So just from rubbing against there, you can see my finger's wiggling, or my thumb is wiggling, and you can see it sort of, and in the left hand side it's not quite as pronounced. I think that's the right hand side and this is the left. So left, right. But we'll see. I'll cut open the walls and we'll see what the difference in thickness is like. Actually, no. And if I were better situated, I could show you which direction the blood flows by, quite grossly, sticking a hose in one of the atria and then turning the tap on and then watching the water flow around. Quite gross, but whatever works. So I'm cutting through this fatty tissue. You can see there's a lot of connective tissue here. And in fact, I believe this might be the remnants of our atrioventricular valve. So obviously, each chamber in the heart has multiple sort of inlets and outlets going in and out of it, either taking blood in, taking blood out. And in order to make sure there's no backflow, there are one-way valves on most of these junctions. So in particular, going from ventricle or atria to ventricles, there's the atrioventricular valves, and then ventricle outwards to your blood vessels, there are valves either semilunar or bicuspid, depending on which side. I'll leave you to figure out which is which. As you can see, we've sort of opened up the heart a bit here. I'm trying to get it in the light, and we can see all these little sort of fibrous things connecting to this circular membrane around where the atria would have been, about here, and I think this is our right ventricle. And these sort of strings here are, I think they're called the chordae tendineae, or heartstrings. So a little fun, well, I say fun fact, a little gross fact for those of you who have read Harry Potter or watched the films. When they talk about having dragon heartstrings as a wand core, that's what they're talking about. Which isn't quite as magical as the books make them out to be, but there you are. Right, so we've got the remnants of atria here, and there would have been a more pronounced valve here, but it's obviously, when it's been cut, been a bit macerated. And then, again, quite grossly, I'm going to insert, I think I'll try a little finger, and then we can see that little patch of blue poking out one of those vessels. This is a relatively thin-walled, relatively small vessel that comes out of a ventricle, and so therefore I'm feeling pretty confident in labelling that the pulmonary artery. Now, way to remember arteries and veins. Arteries go away from the heart, veins go towards us. Pretty straightforward. So what would normally happen is, so blood as it enters into the, I'm going to call this the right atria, gets pumped into the right ventricle and then gets pumped out, up into the pulmonary artery. That pulmonary artery would then circle around to the lungs, where gas exchange takes place in the alveoli, and then that would then feed back in to the pulmonary vein, which would then feed into the left atria. And again, this is a bit macerated, so we don't quite have the perfect example of that. And that would feed into the left atria, which then goes to the left ventricle, and then that, as I'm hoping will be demonstrated in a minute, then pumps out of the aorta. So let's properly bifurcate that. So we've got our nice, so you can see the wall thickness there of the right ventricles, quite displayed there. And again, I'm not going to start poking too much, otherwise I'll destroy what we've got. So I'm just going to cut into the left side of the heart now, through the atrioventricular valve, and you can see there more of those heartstrings. We've got a bit more of the membrane that would have been the atrioventricular valve there, and hopefully if I can find, where's this go? So that's your aorta. Where does that lead? Might have collapsed slightly when it's been processed. This is undeniably gross. No way around that. Come on. So I think because this has been processed and frozen and defrosted, it's a bit harder to display. But I think if I wiggle around enough, I will be able to find the aorta. Right. Stop it. Where the fuck is that aorta going? Let's try a stick. That always works out well. Aha. Okay. Okay, so after a bit of fiddling, I have indeed found the pathway to the aorta. It's right behind the atrioventricular valve there, and you might be able to see the valve in the middle there, but I think I'm going to cut through it a bit more. So we've got blood coming in through this, what would have been a valve here, but I've sort of opened it up a bit. And then once this ventricle contracts, again, my fingers are a bit too clumsy to get the message across, but there is a pathway up out of the ventricle, out through the aorta, which would then feed the rest of the body. Now I'm going to dissect through the walls of the aorta. I might try and go in through this way. Try and get a view of it, and then hopefully, if we're lucky, there'll be a coronary artery bypassing or offshooting somewhere. So might be that. This is quite difficult to grasp. I don't know if that picks up very well on camera, but that is thick and rubbery as a high pressure artery should be, really. So I think, well, I'm not entirely sure, that there, this little opening, leads into a coronary artery, and there might be another one there. It's kind of hard to see when it's, oh yeah, there you are. So there's that tiny little hole there, which you might be able to see just about on camera, but lucky you're going to get a closer view if the camera will focus properly. So in here, there's a tiny little hole there. I'll be able to just about see where the point of my my needle is, and that is going to be the offshoot for, I'm guessing, just from the structure, it's one of the coronary arteries. And as you may know, when those coronary arteries get blocked up, in either by fat or blood clot or so on, this then cuts off the healthy flow of blood to the heart muscle, and then you get heart muscle death, which is a heart attack or a myocardial infarction. So myo, muscle, cardial is a heart, or Greek or Latin for heart, and then you've got infarction, which is just blocking off that blood supply. You can sometimes see the sort of blood vessels running down, but I think there's a bit too much fat on this heart to actually properly see it. So opening it up, I think we're pretty much done. It's a very short dissection. It is not, at least from a muscular standpoint and from a vessel standpoint, it's not a very complicated organ. You've got your left atria up here, or what's left of it, feeding down with these sort of parachute-like chordae tendineae holding this valve. And what's very important about these chordae tendineae is that does prevent the valve from inverting under pressure. So you want it nice and tense, so it's not letting blood flow back into the atria or into the previous chamber, whichever vessel you might be talking about. So I think that's pretty much it. I'm sure you'll have lots of lovely diagrams to look at. And last thing I'll leave you with is just a sort of visual representation of the difference in thickness between the two chambers. So this is our right hand side here, and you can see there that's probably a decent sized cross section. So you can probably see if I pick up a bit further. That's a decent cross section of the right hand side of the ventricle, or right hand ventricle of the heart. And if we rotate it round, that is the cross section of the left ventricle. That sort of thickness. So it's easily double, sometimes triple the thickness. A lot more muscle fibers, a lot more force behind the contractions, and hopefully you'll see why that's important in serving the rest of the body. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I haven't, because this is... I'll see you later.